By the time anyone realized Emily Hart was gone, it was already far too late to ask when, exactly, she had disappeared. Emily came into the world on a rainy night in late October, in a county hospital where the overhead lights hummed and the nurses moved like they were trying not to disturb the silence. Her mother, Karen Hart, arrived alone, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and cheap perfume. Her father, Daniel, showed up 2 hours later, pale and unsteady, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn jacket. The nurses had seen their kind before. The hurried whispers, the tense phone calls, the familiar note in the doctor's voice when he asked quietly at the nurse's station, "Has child services been notified yet?" The Hart family already had a thick file. Years of instability, missed appointments, and reports from neighbors about shouting, broken glass, and children out at strange hours. Their 2 older kids, Tyler and Megan, had been on and off the radar of child protection for most of their young lives. So when baby Emily was born, healthy but small, there was already a decision waiting for her. Within days, a social worker arrived with a soft voice and a hard expression, held the tiny bundle in her arms, and carried her out of the hospital to a car parked under a flickering streetlight. Emily's life with the Millers began that night. Mark and Susan Miller lived in a modest, 2-story house on a quiet street in the town of Crestwood. He worked as an electrician, she as a preschool assistant. They had been foster parents for years, the kind who kept extra blankets folded in the linen closet and a spare toothbrush still wrapped in plastic for whichever child might arrive next. But when Susan first cradled Emily in her arms, something felt different. The baby blinked up at her with sleepy, unfocused eyes, and Susan whispered, "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Susan. We're going to take good care of you, okay?" Mark leaned over her shoulder, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "She's beautiful," he murmured. "She's home now." Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Emily's bassinet was replaced by a crib, then a toddler bed covered in cartoon animals. Her first word, shouted from the high chair, was "Mama," directed straight at Susan. Her first step happened between Mark's outstretched hands in the living room, the moment caught on a shaky phone video that Susan watched late at night when she couldn't sleep. They knew Emily was technically temporary. Every letter, every meeting with the county reminded them of that. Still, they decorated her room with soft yellow paint and paper butterflies. They bought her favorite cereal in bulk. They celebrated her birthdays with balloons and a cake covered in too many sprinkles. And quietly, they started talking about adoption. "We could give her our last name," Mark said one evening as they watched Emily draw on the living room rug. "Make it official." Susan hesitated, hope and fear tangled in her chest. "If the court lets us," she replied. "If Karen and Daniel don't follow through with their plan." That plan, according to case files and court reports, was always the same: treatment programs, parenting classes, stable housing. On paper, it sounded promising. In reality, it was a revolving door of promises made and broken. Still, the system believed in reunification whenever possible. The records showed effort, enough effort to keep the goal, return home, instead of adoption. Visits started when Emily was barely old enough to understand. Supervised meetings in a cramped office, toys stacked in plastic bins, a caseworker sitting in the corner with a clipboard. Karen would arrive late, sunglasses on, hands shaking slightly. Daniel would make big, clumsy attempts at playing, trying to coax smiles out of a child who clung to Susan's leg and buried her face in her foster mother's jeans. Over time, the visits moved from supervised to unsupervised. A park for an hour. Then 2. Then afternoons at a fast food restaurant while the caseworker checked in by phone. Emily would come back quieter those days, smelling of cigarette smoke and something greasy, holding onto a cheap plastic toy as if it were a lifeline. "Did you have fun?" Susan would ask gently. Emily's shoulders would lift in a small shrug. "Mommy was tired," she'd say, meaning Karen now. Daddy yelled at the lady at the counter. "I spilled my drink." At night, Mark and Susan lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the baby monitor that they still hadn't put away, even though Emily was almost 5. "She doesn't know them," Mark whispered. "Not really. Her whole life has been here." "I know," Susan replied, voice tight. "But they're saying her parents are doing better. They're talking about overnight visits." The first overnight visit left Emily coming home with dark circles under her eyes and a small bruise on her shin she couldn't quite explain. The second came with a report from a neighbor, raised voices in the apartment hallway, a door slamming, a child crying. Susan called the caseworker, her voice shaking. She described the bruise, the stories Emily told in broken, confused pieces. She talked about the smell of the clothes in her backpack, the way the child flinched when someone raised their voice. The caseworker listened, took notes, and sighed. "I hear you," she said carefully. "But the court is very focused on reunification. The parents have checked most of the boxes. We'll keep monitoring. Document everything, okay?" Everything was documented: photos, dates, little notes written in the margins of a spiral notebook Susan kept hidden in her nightstand. And then, one gray morning, the phone call came. A court date. A final hearing. "We're recommending she be returned to her parents full-time," the caseworker explained. "We'll keep the file open for a while, of course. There will be check-ins. But the goal has always been to reunite Emily with her biological family." Susan sat at the kitchen table, the world spinning just slightly. "Do you really think it's safe?" she asked. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I think," the caseworker said at last, "that the judge believes they've done what was asked of them." On the day Emily left, the Miller house was too quiet. A small suitcase stood by the door, stuffed with carefully folded dresses and a favorite stuffed rabbit with worn ears. Emily wore a pink hoodie and clutched the rabbit to her chest, eyes wide and uncertain. "Do I have to go?" she whispered to Susan. Susan forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're just going to stay with your other mom and dad now," she said softly. "But we love you. That never changes, okay?" Mark knelt in front of her, his hands trembling as he smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "You call if you ever can, kiddo," he said, choking on the words. "You remember that we're always thinking about you." A social worker arrived, paperwork in hand, car engine idling in the driveway. Emily climbed into the back seat, buckling herself in with slow, clumsy fingers. She turned to look at the house, at the front porch where she'd played with chalk, at the window of the room that had always been hers. Susan stood on the porch and watched as the car pulled away, her hand pressed over her mouth, eyes burning. Mark rested a hand on her shoulder, but his own face was pale, his jaw clenched. The car turned the corner and disappeared from view. Susan didn't know it then, but that was the last time she would ever see Emily Hart alive. Emily's new home sat on the edge of town, a weathered duplex with peeling paint and a sagging porch rail that creaked under even the lightest step. The grass out front had grown wild, dotted with empty cans and a faded toy truck missing its wheels. A curtain in the front window hung crooked, half torn from the rod. When the social worker walked Emily up the steps, Karen opened the door with a forced smile and a cigarette tucked behind her ear. "There she is," she said, voice overly bright. "Come on in, sweetheart." Daniel stood behind her, leaning against the wall. He nodded once at the social worker, but his eyes skimmed past Emily as if she were another piece of mail being delivered. Inside, the air felt heavy. A sour smell clung to the carpets, mixed with something metallic and sharp. The living room was cluttered, clothes piled on chairs, dishes stacked in the sink, a TV blaring a game show no one seemed to be watching. Emily hesitated just inside the doorway, rabbit clutched tight to her chest. Karen crouched down, reaching out like she expected a hug. "You remember us, right?" she asked, her voice softening. Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure she did. The social worker spent 20 minutes going over paperwork and expectations. Karen nodded through most of it. Daniel kept shifting his weight, glancing toward the back hallway. When the final signatures were made, the social worker bent down to Emily's level. "You'll be okay," she said with a tight smile. "I'll check in soon." And then she left. The door clicked shut, and the house fell silent except for the TV's buzzing drone. Karen straightened, brushing dust from her jeans. "Well," she said, exhaling, "you hungry?" Emily shook her head. Karen shrugged and walked into the kitchen, leaving her standing alone in the middle of her new life. In the days that followed, Emily tried to learn the rhythms of the Hart household. She slept in a small back bedroom with a lopsided dresser and a thin blanket that smelled unfamiliar. At night, she could hear her parents arguing through the walls, muffled voices rising, breaking, rising again. Sometimes a door slammed so hard the floor seemed to tremble. Meals were unpredictable. Sometimes she ate cereal from a cracked bowl, other times something microwaved and half-frozen. Some nights, no dinner seemed to come at all. She learned quickly not to ask. Her siblings, 10-year-old Tyler and 8-year-old Megan, drifted in and out of the house, often unsupervised. They were friendly in a distant way, unsure how to include a little sister they barely remembered. Still, Megan would sometimes sit beside Emily and braid her hair with practiced fingers, whispering, "It's better if you stay quiet. They get mad less." Emily nodded. She already knew. Her parents tried, at first, to follow the plan the court had set for them. But the appointments were missed more often than kept, and the check-ins became hurried attempts to make the house look cleaner than it ever really was. When social workers visited, the family put on a performance, smiles, assurances, quick promises that they were adjusting. After each visit, the mask slipped. "Why'd you sit there like that?" Karen snapped one afternoon when the worker left. "You made us look bad." Emily didn't know what she had done wrong. She had answered the questions exactly like they told her, short, polite, safe. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Karen sighed, rubbing her forehead. "Just, don't make things harder. Okay?" Emily nodded, because what else could she do? The first sign that something was deeply wrong came from a neighbor, Mrs. Pierce, a retired teacher who often sat on her porch with a crossword puzzle balanced on her knee. She watched the Hart children walk to school each morning, their backpacks dragging, their hair uncombed. But one morning, there were only two. "Where's your little sister?" she asked them gently. Tyler shrugged. "Mom said she's sleeping." For days, Emily didn't appear. No footsteps. No small voice playing in the yard. No pink hoodie among the laundry Karen sometimes hung outside. Later, Mrs. Pierce would remember the uneasy feeling that settled in her chest. She would tell officers that she considered walking over, knocking on the door, checking. But she talked herself out of it, told herself she was being dramatic, intrusive. Others noticed too, though no one acted quickly enough. A cousin stopped by one weekend and asked casually, "Where's the little one?" Karen waved the question away. "At a friend's house." A week later, she said Emily was with a relative. Then at school. Then sick. Then visiting her old foster family. The stories shifted like sand. And still, no one saw her. Then came the fire. It happened in the early hours of the morning, a rush of flames licking up one side of the duplex, smoke pouring into the sky. Firefighters arrived within minutes, containing the blaze before it spread farther. The Hart stood outside barefoot, wrapped in thin blankets, shivering under the flashing lights. "It started in the kitchen," Daniel said, voice hoarse. "Faulty outlet." But when a neighbor asked where Emily was, Karen stiffened. "She's fine," she snapped. "She wasn't here tonight." The neighbor frowned. "But I haven't seen her in months." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Mind your own business." The next day, whispers spread through the community. The contradictions, the excuses, the silence. Eventually someone made the call that should have been made long before. A report to Child Protection Services. Within the week, police officers were knocking on the Hart family's front door for a welfare check. And somewhere far from the noise of sirens and radios, the world of the Millers, the couple who once tucked Emily into bed and kissed her goodnight, began to tilt again, unaware that the child they loved might never be coming home. The officers who arrived at the Hart residence on a gray Thursday afternoon had been on dozens of welfare checks before, but something about this one felt different from the moment they stepped out of the patrol car. The house looked abandoned despite the 2 bicycles sprawled in the yard. A trash bag had split near the steps, its contents scattered across the walkway. A faint smell, sour, damp, and unmistakably wrong, drifted from the open window. Officer Grant knocked firmly. Police Department. Welfare check. Shuffling footsteps approached, followed by the uneven click of a chain sliding free. Karen opened the door halfway, her hair unbrushed, her expression tight. "Oh. Yeah. We heard you were coming," she muttered. "May we come in?" Grant asked. Karen hesitated, then stepped back with a forced smile. "Sure. House is a mess, sorry." Inside, the officers exchanged a quick glance. Mess didn't cover it. Dishes crusted with food filled the sink, piles of clothing lay on the floor, and the walls were streaked with smudges that looked weeks old. The television played loudly though no one was watching. Tyler and Megan sat at the table, eyes down, coloring silently. Officer Ruiz crouched beside them. "Hey, kids. How are you two doing?" Megan shrugged without looking up. "Okay. Is your little sister home today?" Ruiz asked, keeping her tone light. Both children froze, just a heartbeat, but enough to notice. Megan's crayon rolled slowly across the table. Tyler swallowed hard. "Mom said she's staying somewhere else," he mumbled. Grant turned to Karen. "Ma'am, we need to verify Emily's safety. Can you tell us where she is?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "She's with a family friend. She's fine." "What's the name of this friend?" Grant asked. Karen blinked. Rachel." "Rachel who?" Silence. Ruiz stepped closer. "When was the last time you saw your daughter?" Karen crossed her arms defensively. "Why does that matter?" "She's fine. You people always think the worst." "It matters," Grant replied calmly, "because we have multiple reports that Emily hasn't been seen in months. We need to make sure she's safe." At that moment, Daniel emerged from the hallway, rubbing the back of his neck. "What's going on?" The officers repeated the question. He frowned, glanced at Karen, then said, "She's with my sister." "Your sister's name?" Grant asked. "Sarah." Karen shot him a sharp look. He didn't return it. Ruiz exhaled. "Ma'am, sir, you're giving conflicting information. We need clarity." Karen's voice rose, brittle and shaking. "We told you, she's fine. Why are you even here?" "Because," Grant said quietly, "no one has seen your daughter. Not neighbors. Not relatives. Not the school she was supposed to attend. And there was a fire here last month that you gave 3 different explanations for." Daniel's jaw tensed. "We're not bad parents." Ruiz glanced at the children at the table, thin, pale, watching everything. "Where is Emily?" she asked again. Neither parent spoke. The officers searched the house. They found 2 children's beds, clothing for Megan and Tyler, school papers, crayons, half-eaten snacks. But Emily's belongings, the pink hoodie, the tiny sneakers, the stuffed rabbit she never slept without, were nowhere. Her supposed bedroom was empty except for a bare mattress pushed against the wall and a small dresser filled with old papers. Dust coated the windowsill. A child hadn't lived in that room for a long time. Grant opened closet doors, checked behind furniture, stepped over trash bags, and scanned every corner. Nothing. No signs of a 5-year-old girl anywhere in the home. Ruiz stepped into the hall bathroom and paused. The tub was stained, the counter cluttered, and behind a stack of towels lay a small bracelet, a beaded one, pink and yellow, handmade. The kind a child might wear. Karen appeared suddenly in the doorway. "That's old," she snapped. "She outgrew it." Ruiz didn't reply. But she gently slipped the bracelet into an evidence bag. When the officers regrouped in the living room, Grant spoke firmly. "Your daughter hasn't lived here in months. We need to know what happened." Daniel's voice grew defensive. "We didn't hurt her." "Often," Ruiz said softly, "when a child is missing, parents are the ones who can help us find them. But you're not helping." Karen wiped her hands on her jeans, shaking. We let her stay with someone for a while. Things were stressful. We thought it was temporary." "What's the name of this person?" Grant pressed. Karen stared at the floor. "I don't know." "Then how did you take her there?" Daniel interrupted, "It was months ago, okay? We don't remember everything." Grant's expression hardened. "You don't remember where you left your daughter?" Silence again, heavier this time. Ruiz leaned toward him. "Sir, do you understand how serious this is?" Daniel's shoulders slumped. "We didn't, she wasn't, it wasn't supposed to go like this." Karen covered her face with both hands. A low, broken sound escaped her, not quite a sob, more like frustration hitting a cracking point. But still, neither of them said where Emily was. That evening, with the house cleared and the children temporarily removed for safety, officers filed their initial report. The conclusion was grim. There was no plausible way Emily had been living there recently. No food for her, no clothes, no toys, no bedding, nothing. And based on how long she had been unaccounted for, there was no reasonable possibility she could have survived on her own. The missing child bulletin went out within hours. Crime scene tape went up. Search teams assembled at dawn. And quietly, word reached the Millers. Susan was folding laundry when her phone rang. When she heard the officer's voice, her hands went slack. A shirt slipped from her fingers onto the floor. Mark walked into the room just as she whispered, "Missing? What do you mean missing?" He watched the color drain from her face. "No," she murmured. "No, she was supposed to be safe. They said she'd be safe." Then the phone slid from her hand, and she began to cry in a way he had never heard before. Because deep down, they both knew. This wasn't the kind of missing that ended with a child found safe. This was the kind of missing that left a hollow echo where a life used to be. The official search for Emily Hart began before sunrise, when the first team of officers stepped into the chilly morning air and adjusted the straps of their radios. Fog clung to the ground like a pale, shifting blanket. Volunteers gathered in small groups near the community center, wrapping their hands around steaming cups of coffee as they waited for instructions. Some had known the Hart family only in passing. Others had never heard the name until the news broke. But all of them understood the same grim truth. A child missing for months did not leave much hope behind. Detective Laura Bennett, the lead investigator assigned to the case, stood at the front of the search team briefing, her voice steady though her jaw was tight. "We are looking for any sign of Emily," she said. "Clothing, personal items, disturbed soil, evidence of travel. The parents' statements remain inconsistent. Until proven otherwise, we must treat this as a criminal investigation." Beside her, a board displayed a printed photo of the little girl, 5 years old, blonde hair held back with a pale pink clip, smiling with shy uncertainty. Bennett paused, letting the silence settle. We search until we have answers. Back at the Hart residence, forensic teams combed through every inch of the home. Cameras flashed as they documented the rooms. Black fingerprint dust-coated doorknobs and cabinet handles. Evidence markers dotted the floor like scattered seeds. One investigator paused near the bare mattress in the small back room that had been labeled Emily's bedroom, though nothing inside it belonged to her. He knelt, running a gloved hand over the dust. No small footprints. No toys kicked beneath the bed. No stray socks or hair ties. It was as if she had been erased. Behind the house, the yard offered little more. A shallow patch of dirt where weeds had been recently pulled caught their attention, but soil analysis later showed nothing conclusive. The dumpster was searched, the crawlspace inspected, even the attic examined with specialized cameras. Still, no trace. Detective Bennett studied the scene from the doorway, her brow furrowed. She didn't disappear, she murmured to herself. Somebody knows exactly what happened. Meanwhile, interviews began. Relatives arrived one by one at the station, shifting nervously in plastic chairs. Some offered halting concern, others admitted they had long suspected something was wrong but hadn't been sure whether to speak up. A cousin recalled seeing Emily once after her return home, timid, thinner than she remembered, clinging to Megan's sleeve. When she asked how Emily was doing, Karen had laughed it off, saying, "Kids are tough. She'll adjust." Another relative reported overhearing arguments between the parents, mentioning that Karen often complained she couldn't handle all 3 kids. But no one claimed to know where Emily had gone. No one admitted seeing her for months. One aunt lowered her voice and whispered, "I didn't want to believe it, but I think something bad happened. I think the kids know more than they're saying." The detectives took note. When police finally sat down with Tyler and Megan in a child-safe interview room, pastel walls, stuffed animals on shelves, both siblings appeared frightened but strangely resigned. They answered questions hesitantly, eyes drifting to the corners of the room as though they expected their parents to appear at any moment. "Do you know where your sister is?" the interviewer asked gently. Tyler shook his head, shoulders hunched. "She's gone." "What do you mean gone?" He rubbed his eyes. "Mom and Dad said not to ask about her anymore." Megan's voice was barely a whisper. "She cried a lot before she wasn't here." The room went still. The interviewer leaned closer. "Do you remember when you last saw her?" Megan nodded once. "She had a bruise. Dad said she fell, but I don't think she fell." Tyler glanced at her sharply, fear flooding his expression. "Don't say stuff like that." But the damage was done, a small crack in the wall of silence the parents had built. Detectives later noted in their report that the siblings did not appear to be inventing stories. Their words were fragmented, confused, but consistent. Emily had been mistreated. Emily had been injured. And then one day, Emily was simply gone. Public outrage grew quickly. News vans lined the street outside the Hart home. Commentators questioned how a child with a history of risk factors had been returned to her biological parents without closer follow-up. Social media erupted with hashtags demanding accountability. Community members held candlelight vigils, leaving stuffed animals and handwritten messages near the police station. The Millers, though grieving intensely, attended the first vigil. Susan clutched a framed photo of Emily taken during her last birthday with them, her cheeks dusted with frosting, her eyes bright. Mark stood beside her, holding her hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. A woman approached cautiously. "You were her foster parents, right?" "I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how this feels." Susan nodded, her voice cracking. "She was our little girl. And we trusted the system to protect her." She didn't add the rest, that the guilt sometimes felt unbearable, that she replayed every meeting, every warning sign, every conversation with the caseworker, wondering if she should have fought harder, louder, more desperately. Mark wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We won't stop until we know what happened," he said quietly. And they meant it. Back at the station, Detective Bennett studied the case file deep into the night. Her desk lamp cast long shadows across the reports, interviews, search results, photos, timelines. Everything pointed to one chilling conclusion. Emily had not simply wandered off. She had not been taken in by a friend or a distant relative. The Harts knew something they refused to say. And with every hour that passed, the truth felt farther away. As Bennett leaned back in her chair, exhaustion tugging at her eyes, one thought pressed heavily against her chest. They were racing against time not to save Emily, but to uncover what was left of her story. The arrests came swiftly. Detective Bennett and two uniformed officers approached the Hart residence at dusk, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Karen answered the door with a dazed expression, as though she hadn't slept in days. Daniel appeared behind her, jaw clenched, eyes darting between the officers like a cornered animal searching for an exit. "Karen Hart, Daniel Hart," Bennett announced, her voice firm and unyielding. "You are both under arrest." Karen stiffened. "For what?" "We didn't do anything." "You are being charged with obstruction and endangering your children," Bennett continued. "You have repeatedly failed to provide truthful information regarding your daughter's whereabouts." Megan and Tyler watched from the hallway, their faces pale and unreadable. As handcuffs clicked around their parents' wrists, neither child cried. Neither reached out. Neither spoke. It was as if they had already lived through worse. The officers led Karen and Daniel out into the evening light, placing them into separate patrol cars. A small crowd formed on the sidewalk, neighbors whispering, heads shaking, phones raised. As the patrol cars pulled away, Megan took her brother's hand, gripping it so tightly her knuckles blanched. By nightfall, both children were in protective custody. And the investigation accelerated with renewed urgency. Inside the interview rooms at the county jail, detectives sat across from Karen and Daniel separately. The walls were blank, the lights harsh, the air dense with the unspoken truth hanging between them. "Where is Emily?" Bennett asked each of them, over and over. Karen insisted she had left the girl with a friend, though she couldn't provide a name, an address, or a phone number. Daniel insisted she had gone, to stay with someone for a bit, but his story changed each time he repeated it. Neither explanation held. Neither parent showed real surprise when detectives played back the recording of Tyler and Megan's statements. Neither asked if Emily was alive. That silence, Bennett later noted, was more telling than any confession. When investigators questioned the two remaining children further, a clearer, darker picture began to form. The siblings never described a single moment outright, no abrupt act, no vivid detail, but their words painted the outline of a child trapped in a home where fear shaped every day. "She got hurt a lot," Megan whispered. "Sometimes for things that weren't her fault." "Mom said she cried too much," Tyler added, eyes fixed on the table. "And after the fire, they got really angry." "Angry at who?" the interviewer asked softly. The boy swallowed. "At her." A long silence followed. The hum of the ceiling vent filled the space where the rest of the truth should have been. "Did you see what happened to her?" the interviewer asked. Both children shook their heads. "She was just gone one morning," Megan said. "Like she disappeared." Tyler whispered, barely audible, "Dad told us not to talk about her anymore." Their testimony was heartbreaking, fragments, shadows, emotions too large for children to articulate, but it guided investigators toward one grim conclusion: Emily had not vanished on her own, nor had she simply been misplaced by overwhelmed parents. Something irreversible had happened. In the days that followed, additional charges were brought against Karen and Daniel when tests revealed both surviving children had been exposed to illegal substances. Prosecutors moved quickly, securing protective orders to prevent the parents from contacting the children or discussing the case publicly. Behind bars, the couple grew increasingly defensive. Karen lashed out during hearings, accusing the system of targeting her. Daniel sat stone-faced beside his attorney, answering most questions with a shrug or a muttered, "I don't remember." But the public remembered. Dozens of citizens attended every court appearance, filling benches usually left empty. Some carried photos of Emily printed from news broadcasts. Others brought candles, flowers, or signs demanding justice. At the center of one hearing, Susan and Mark Miller sat quietly in the second row, their hands clasped tightly together. They had been warned that they might not want to hear the details as investigators presented timelines and evidence. But they came anyway. When the prosecutor announced that the search for Emily was now officially a recovery mission, not a rescue operation, Susan closed her eyes. Mark turned his face away, jaw trembling. They had always feared this. Hearing it said aloud made it real. Even as the legal case advanced, investigators refused to stop searching. Teams returned to the Hart home with cadaver dogs. Volunteers combed wooded areas. Old wells and drainage culverts were examined. Tips came in from across the state, people claiming to have seen a child who might be Emily, others insisting she had been taken by a stranger. Every lead ended the same way, nowhere. There were no sightings. No remains. No belongings. No trace. It was as though a 5-year-old girl had slipped through a crack in the world and vanished without leaving a single footprint behind. Detective Bennett knew better. People didn't disappear. People were hidden. And the only ones who knew where Emily was were sitting in jail cells refusing to speak. One evening, long after most of the station had emptied, Bennett stood alone in the evidence room. Rows of boxes lined the shelves, each labeled with numbers and dates. The box marked with Emily's name was painfully light, a bracelet, a photograph, a few reports. Too little for a life. She closed the lid and leaned against the table, exhaustion tugging at her shoulders. Cases like these rarely ended with closure. They lingered. They haunted. They lived in the empty spaces of unsolved mysteries and unanswered questions. But Bennett made herself a quiet promise as she switched off the lights. She would not let Emily become another forgotten file. Somewhere, there was a truth waiting to be found. And she intended to find it. Months passed, then years, but the investigation into Emily Hart's disappearance never slipped quietly into the background the way some cold cases eventually do. Instead, it lingered like a bruise on the community, a constant reminder of a child who should have been protected, a system that had failed her, and a truth that refused to come to light. Every so often, the sheriff's office released updates, renewed searches, new forensic testing, interviews with people who had once orbited the Hart family. None brought the answers they sought. Still, Detective Laura Bennett pushed forward, driven not by the possibility of solving the case, but by the weight of a promise she had made to herself on a quiet night in the evidence room. She would not let Emily be forgotten. Behind the scenes, the legal proceedings against Karen and Daniel continued. Though neither parent faced charges directly connected to Emily's disappearance, the convictions for obstruction, neglect, and endangerment carried heavy sentences. Their courtroom demeanor grew more brittle with each hearing. Karen alternated between angry outbursts and tearful denials, insisting the world had turned against her. "They took everything from me," she shouted during one session. This was all a misunderstanding. The judge responded with a firm, measured tone. "Your unwillingness to cooperate is the reason the investigation cannot move forward." Daniel remained colder. Detached. His attorney spoke for him most of the time, while he stared at the table, refusing to lift his eyes to the gallery where members of the community, and the Millers, watched in silence. Yet even during sentencing, when the judge addressed the pair about the gravity of their actions, neither asked the one question everyone expected. "Is Emily alive?" Their silence reverberated through the courtroom like a final, chilling confession. Public pressure continued to grow. Advocates demanded sweeping reforms for children transitioning out of foster care. Community leaders held meetings urging improvements in oversight, follow-up visits, and risk assessments. Local politicians introduced proposals named in memory of the child whose fate remained unknown. Signs appeared along the road near the courthouse, small, laminated posters showing Emily's photo beside a hotline number. Some were fastened with zip ties to lamp posts, others fluttered in the breeze from ribbons tied by volunteers. Rain warped a few of them, but people replaced them each time they began to fade. At one gathering, a woman who had never met Emily stood at the microphone and said, "This is not just one family's tragedy. It's ours. This should never happen again." Applause rose from the crowd, a somber, unified vow. The Millers stayed quiet through most public events, not because they lacked emotion, but because their grief had settled into a deep, private ache. They attended every vigil and anniversary gathering, holding hands, offering gentle nods to strangers who approached with sympathy. Inside their home, Emily's room remained exactly as it had been on the day she left. The yellow walls still glowed softly in the afternoon light. The paper butterflies still hung from the ceiling on delicate threads. Her favorite books sat neatly on the shelf, their spines worn from bedtime readings. Sometimes, late at night, Susan would stand in the doorway, unable to step inside. The faint smell of lavender from an old bottle of children's lotion lingered in the air, almost too painful to breathe in. "She loved it here," she whispered once, her voice cracking. "She was ours," Mark murmured, placing a hand on her back. "She always will be." They lived with two parallel truths. Emily had been taken from them twice, once by the system, and once by something far worse, and yet she remained a part of their family forever. Despite the lack of new evidence, the sheriff's office kept the case open. Each tip was investigated. Each rumor chased down. Each year, the reward was renewed, sometimes increased. Detective Bennett held annual briefings, standing in front of reporters and repeating the same message. "We have not given up. Someone knows what happened." When asked whether she believed the parents would ever talk, Bennett paused, choosing her words carefully. "There is always a chance," she said. "People's consciences change with time. Circumstances change. Fear fades. Then, quietly, and sometimes, the truth finds another way out." On the 10th anniversary of Emily's disappearance, the community held its largest vigil yet. Hundreds gathered at dusk, candles flickering in the gentle wind. A path of rose petals led to a small display at the center, a framed photo of Emily, surrounded by stuffed animals, flowers, and handwritten notes. Children who had once lived near the Hart family spoke softly about remembering her in faint fragments, a shy wave in a grocery store, a small girl with a stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Others admitted they were too young to remember her at all, yet came because the story had become part of the town's fabric. Detective Bennett stood among them, staring at the picture of the smiling 5-year-old. A girl frozen in time. She bowed her head as the crowd fell silent. "Wherever you are," someone whispered into the stillness, "we haven't stopped looking." Susan and Mark stood in the front row. When the candles were lifted, their lights reflected in Susan's eyes, turning her tears into tiny, trembling stars. In the end, Emily Hart's story became more than an unsolved case. It became a call for vigilance, a reminder of how deeply a child's life depends on the compassion and courage of the adults around them. Policies changed. Training improved. Oversight strengthened. Families who fostered children felt more supported. Social workers received better tools to evaluate risk. And those who once stayed silent became quicker to speak up. Though Emily herself remained missing, her absence reshaped the world she left behind. A legacy carved out of heartbreak, but a legacy nonetheless. And so, the story of Emily Hart rests in the quiet place between memory and hope. A little girl with a pink hair clip, a shy smile, and a life stolen too soon. A community that refuses to forget her. And an unanswered question that hangs in the air, year after year. If the truth is out there, when will it finally be found? For now, the wind carries only echoes of her name, gentle, persistent, unbroken, reminding all who hear it that some stories refuse to end until justice has been served.